I realize I've used the term breath curve all the time when making my Ocarina videos, but I've never explained what it actually means. Let's fix that. First, what is a breath curve? A breath curve is the relationship between your air pressure and the note that you're playing on the scale. Typically, with most wind instruments, as you ascend the scale, you need more air to match it. The breath curve for an ocarina is probably best shown as a graph. On the x-axis, we have the note you're playing on the scale, and on the y-axis, you have the air pressure required to play that note in tune. In general, as you ascend the scale, you need higher air pressure. We'll go more in depth with charting these graphs. Now, let's start with the three most common types of breath curves: linear, flat, and concave. Keep in mind that these are all approximations of breath curve models. I lack the scientific equipment or skills to do in-depth, crazy scientific testing of the exact amount of air pressure needed for any given note, but I'm an experienced enough ocarina player that the vibes are there. First, we have the linear breath curve. A linear breath curve, or one that's very close to that, is more or less the same increments of increasing air as you ascend the scale. So let's say this is the lowest note on your scale. To go up to the next note is the same amount of air, the next note the same amount of air, and so on and so forth. This big arrow is a bit more visible with my tiny little mouse, so we'll keep using this for our explanations. A linear breath curve, or a breath curve that very closely approximates a linear shape, is generally most common when it comes to ocarinas. It generally feels the most intuitive to play, especially for beginners, and it does indeed feel natural to increase your airflow as you go up the scale. One good example of an ocarina with a linear breath curve is the Claudio Colombo I use in Okabanda, this bass G. It is quite predictable how much more air I need any given note while ascending the scale. I kind of just wanted an excuse to play this ocarina, but it does work as an example for a linear breath curve, not to be confused with a flat breath curve. A flat breath curve is incredibly uncommon. As you ascend the scale, you actually don't increase your air pressure. Some ocarinas with flat breath curves do exist, and it's really creative how they're tuned. This ocarina I recently reviewed by Miracle M has a linear breath curve. That means I need to increase the amount of air per note on the scale. But if I were to use the exact same air pressure for each note, it would sound very flat. Here it is with the correct breath pressure. Here it is if I play it like a flat breath pressure ocarina. I think I was still intuitively adding more air each note I ascended on the scale, even when I was trying to use the exact same airflow. So the way an ocarina maker would tune an ocarina with a flat breath curve would be to make every note going up the scale a little bit more and a little bit more sharp. If I play a flat breath curve on an ocarina that has an ascending breath curve, it gets flatter and flatter and flatter. So if you tune each note in the ocarina to be sharper and sharper and sharper, were you to play it with a linear curve, it'll end up being in tune with a flat breath curve. Once again, this is incredibly uncommon, but it does help for reference for the next breath curve, which is concave. Going back to a linear breath curve, it is a consistent change in airflow from one note to the next. With a concave breath curve, as you ascend the scale, it's relatively stable, and then after a certain point, you actually need less and less additional air. And after a certain point, you might even need a little bit less air. This is actually quite common for Alto C ocarinas and is exemplified by the Night by Noble. With the Night by Noble, you do not need any additional airflow on the high F compared to the high E to stay relatively in tune. One of the most common complaints people have with Alto C ocarinas in general is that the highest notes tend to be a little bit airy, and people think, what am I doing wrong? And what they try to do to fix it is they blow more air, which actually makes the problem worse. This is one reason why people do the acute bend technique on 12-hole Alto Cs, because it forces you to blow out a little bit less air on high notes while still feeling the power in your diaphragm. So if you have a 12-hole Alto C and you find that your highest notes are a little bit airy, try blowing with a little bit less air than you think you need. You might have an ocarina with a concave breath curve. This breath curve is less intuitive than linear, linear, but that does not mean the ocarina is poorly tuned. I think a concave breath curve is a perfectly intuitive breath curve once you're used to it. It just might not be beginner friendly, which is one reason why, as much as I love the Knight by Noble, I think I recommend the Miracle M a little bit more for beginners, because this one has a linear breath curve, whereas this one is concave. Both amazing ocarinas. This one's just a little more beginner friendly. We've talked about breath curves, but how does the overall breath pressure of an ocarina interact with that? For example, what would a high breath pressure ocarina with a linear breath curve look like compared to a low breath pressure one? Both linear, but different shapes. Let's look into it. All right, we're back to the graphs. On the linear breath curve graph, I've added a line for low breath pressure and a line for high breath pressure. Literally just treat this like an algebraic equation. The y-intercept is the amount of air you need for the very lowest note. So in the case of a 12-hole alto C, that'll be the low A. Then the slope is how much the air pressure increases as you ascend the scale. On a low breath pressure ocarina, that slope is fairly low, whereas on a high breath pressure ocarina, that slope is a bit steeper. Basically, the things to consider with a breath curve and the amount of breath pressure are how much air do you need for the lowest note, how much air do you need for the highest note, and what's the average air difference in between per note. For a flat breath curved ocarina, a high breath pressure would just be a high line, all high air pressure for every note, whereas low breath pressure would be a low line, low breath pressure for every single note. Last, for ocarinas with concave breath curves, the differences can be a little wonky because there's varying degrees of concavity. It does not necessarily match a linear algebraic equation of y equals mx plus b. For example, a high breath pressure concave ocarina could have a fairly stable breath curve going up and then drop down a lot on its highest notes. A medium breath pressure concave ocarina with a more subtle curve could look more like this, where it doesn't even go downwards at the end. It's just slowly curving. And a low breath pressure concave ocarina, like the Knight by Noble, could have a low y-intercept, a relatively stable slope going up, and then just a slight drop off in breath pressure at the very end. Given all this talk of breath curves, there may be additional models that are outside of my 3 approximations that I've shown. If you know of any, let me know in the comments. But using the model of breath curves, what does it mean for an ocarina to be out of tune? I would say that any ocarina that doesn't have some sort of intuitive breath curve would be out of tune. In fact, there may not be a curve at all. It could just be a wacky game of connect the dots, like the model I've drawn as an example. With this example out of tune ocarina, it starts off looking pretty linear, and then suddenly it has a bit of a flat breath curve for a couple more notes, and then there's less air as you're going further up the scale, then a really steep slope, a bit of a lesser slope, then it goes back down and goes flat. There's a somewhat broad linear shape to it. The bottom note and the highest note have a relative trend of going up in a somewhat consistent manner, but within the ocarina's breath curve, as you ascend notes, there are unpredictable changes in breath curve that you cannot intuit. The first few notes may feel in tune, and then going up to these next few notes in the flat region may still feel okay, but then the drop and then the steep slope upward, that is not intuitive. This is what I mean sometimes when I say the ocarina is the problem, not you, if it's an ocarina that's out of tune. There's no way that you can intuit a proper breath curve from this. If you're an experienced player, you might be able to end up playing this ocarina in tune, but at what cost? Why not play an ocarina that feels more natural for you? So out of tune simply means that the ocarina does not have an intuitive, natural, or predictable breath curve. There's more ways an ocarina can be out of tune, but that's how it relates to breath curves. And if your ocarina follows a linear breath curve, a flat breath curve, or some sort of concave or convex breath curve, chances are it's in tune. Which breath curve is your favorite and which are you most comfortable playing? In fact, what's your favorite ocarina and what type of breath curve do you think it has? Let me know in the comments. I assume most of you are gonna say linear, but I'm open to surprises. Also, I do not own any ocarinas with a flat breath curve, so if you know of an ocarina with a flat breath curve, let me know, please. I want to get one. And last, I am an experienced ocarinist, but I am nowhere near the most experienced. If there's other breath curve approximations or models that you've encountered, other than the 3 I've listed, please let me know and I'll amend this video somehow. Also, let me know which ocarina has that breath curve model. Otherwise, thank you to my patrons, Joshua and Logan, and hit those good YouTube buttons. Happy tootin'.